3. Oh, this is good. I mean, this is going to be a good crowd then, because I mean, I could start at a very basic level. Just to put that in perspective, so I went to school at Harvard when a book called The Innovator's Dilemma was being written. It was written by a professor of mine, Clayton Christensen. He released the book in 1997. I graduated in 1996. So that book changed pretty much everything that we know about management theory, okay, in terms of technology in particular, but it turns out to be that technology innovation is actually what's driven almost all growth, as far as anyone can remember. So you could probably put the framework to work for, 16th century Holland or 19th century Britain. And so this book was very, very important. It's what Steve Jobs cited it as the only business book he would recommend, probably the only business book he ever read. It's in his biography, this, so I'm not making it up. And I would agree with that. I don't hardly read any business books. I've probably read only 3 or 4. And that's the one I would recommend. It actually was followed by a second book called The Innovator's Solution. So the first was The Innovator's Dilemma, explaining the problem that every big company and every small company faces. The second book is called The Solution, which gives some ideas on how to solve the problem. And then he's had a couple follow-up books that actually deal with individual industries like healthcare and education. And I sort of took that theory to heart and applied it to my own experience, what I experienced at my job in Nokia. So throughout those years I was there, I was reading the book and I was saying, holy cow, it's happening to us and it's happening to this industry. And in 2004 or 2005, I knew that Nokia was in trouble. And I knew that unless it changed dramatically what it was doing, it was going to essentially cease existing. And so I took that message internally and I began to preach it as well. And of course it wasn't listened to, because if you read one of the chapters in the book, it says you will not get listened to. And so the other thing that happened was that we had Apple, coming up. I wasn't really into Apple at all. I mean, I had used their products, of course, even back in the 80s. But my daily work machine was a Windows machine, and my phone was a Nokia phone. It was a very good phone. And I wasn't really paying too much attention except for the iPod. iPod was a phenomenon, and we were trying to study it at Nokia and see what was going on there. Should we make devices that are single function like this versus general purpose? And at the time, it looked like the single function was winning, and so there was this whole debate about what we do. So I was trying to apply the theory at the time. So I got into disruption as a way to frame almost all of my analysis. So we started looking at Microsoft and Palm, every single thing that happened, RIM, everything that was happening, and things were, the theory, if you read the book, it gives you lots of examples going back to the 40s, even the 50s. And you hear about General Electric, and you hear about Sony, and you hear about U.S. Steel, and you hear about the auto industry, and you say, wow, these stories are very compelling, and it seems like this theory applies universally. And then you realize that the time frames that they're describing are measured in decades. If change does happen, and it's almost inevitable that it does happen the way it's predicted, but it takes so long that no one's really affected by that change, because they're probably going to retire by the time it really is an impact, right? So if you were in the car industry in the 1960s and you were told that disruption is going to happen to you, what would you do? Quit your job at General Motors and go do something else because GM is going to go out of business? Well, it did go out of business. It just took 40 years, right? So who cares, right? It's not your problem. It's your kid's problem. So in that sense, what was different about my industry, phone business, was it was happening in real time. It was like almost every year you could see, you could go through the checklist and say, this is happening so quickly, it's going to affect me personally. And I guarantee that all of you are going to face 1 or 2 disruptions in your lives. And so even as a developer, you can think back and say, wow, if you were coding in the 90s, what would you be writing? You'd be writing C, you'd be, all your life, you'd be, perfecting your skills at writing enterprise software. or client server, or worrying about big glue, or whatever it was that you were thinking was the hottest thing back in those years. And of course, by now you'd have to retool. But even in the 90s, you'd have to retool because then the web came, right? And then everybody had to learn what was really a much worse programming environment than what they were used to, right? And so that's very typical, by the way. Or even when I was writing code, it was like Visual Basic came on the scene. Now, how do you go from doing research in a research laboratory, trying to use Lisp and Prolog and try to code for artificial intelligence, and somebody tells you that the future is Visual Basic, on a spreadsheet or something? So, I don't know if we're even going to need that, but so that's a form of disruption where your own skills become obsolete much more quickly than you expect. You have to be very agile, and this is what big businesses have to face. But it's not just that. I wish it were only just about retooling and relearning, because learning is actually something we can build a process around. What really happens is when you don't know that you're being affected by damage,